The carriage had been traveling for 3 hours, through a darkening afternoon when it stopped. There had been no warning, no cry from the coachman, no slowing of wheels, no sound of another vehicle on the Bath road. One moment the bare hedgerows were moving past the window in their winter gray, and the next the horses had come to a stamping, uneasy halt, and Cecily Alderton was bracing herself against the seat, with her hand pressed flat against the cold glass. She heard the coachman's voice, low and uncertain. She heard another voice answer, a man's, calm and unhurried, carrying authority without volume. She could not make out the words. She waited. Outside the window, the light was failing in the particular bronze way of December afternoons, the sky behind the hedgerows the color of pewter edged with fire. Nothing moved on the road. The door opened. He filled it. That was her first impression. Not height alone, though he was tall, but the particular quality of stillness that some very large men carry, as though they have learned long ago that they need not move to hold a room. His cloak was dark and travel-worn, its high collar raised against the wind. The face above it was pale and angular, a faint scar running along the left jaw like an old argument that had been settled. His eyes were dark and met hers without apology. He held out his hand. In his palm was a ring. A gold band, narrow, set with a garnet the color of old claret, with a small pattern etched around the shank, vine leaves, she thought, or something that resembled them in the failing light. "Your ring," he said. "You dropped it on the road." She had not dropped any ring. She owned no ring. The only jewelry she possessed was a paste brooch that had been her mother's, wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of her traveling case, and she had not touched it since Wiltshire. She opened her mouth to say so. She said nothing. He was watching her with those dark eyes, patient, or perhaps simply certain. And she understood, in the way one sometimes understands a thing before the mind has formed the thought, that she was not meant to refuse. The ring was being placed in her keeping. The fiction of its having been dropped was a courtesy extended to them both, so that she could accept what she could not otherwise have taken. Her gloved hand moved before she decided to move it. The ring lay in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. The garnet caught the last pale light from the carriage window and held it for a moment, a small ember. He stepped back. He said nothing more. The carriage door closed with a quiet finality. The coachman clicked to the horses, and the road resumed its passage outside the window as though nothing had interrupted it. She turned to look back through the glass and saw only the road, bare and straight, the hedgerows, the sky's cold declining light. No rider, no dark cloak, no figure on the road at all. Cecily closed her fingers around the ring and sat with it in her closed hand for the rest of the journey. The weight of it pressed against the center of her palm, and did not let herself think about what it meant. There are stories that have no prologue, only a threshold crossed in silence. If you have found your way to this one, stay close. It will ask something of you before it is finished. She had spent 4 years in the service of Lady Aughton of Wiltshire, which was not a long time to give to a woman who took everything as though it were owed her. Lady Aughton had been 73, sharp-minded and softly cruel in the particular way of women who had once been beautiful and now held that beauty's departure against the world. She had wanted Cecily to read to her in the mornings, to write her letters in the afternoons, to sit quietly in the evenings without being decorative enough to attract attention. Cecily had done all of this without complaint for 4 years, and in return Lady Aughton had promised her a small provision, £200 a year, and the use of a furnished room at the Dower House, which had seemed to Cecily, in the cautious calculus of a woman with no family and no income of her own, to be more than enough. Lady Aughton died in October, By November, her nephew, Mr. Gerald Ashton, had arrived from Bristol and engaged a solicitor, and by the first week of December the will had been challenged and the provisions set aside, and Cecily had been given 7 days to remove her things from the house she had lived in for 4 years. Mr. Ashton, who had the solid, affable manner of a man accustomed to being thanked for what he took, had expressed his regret in 3 sentences and had not looked at her while he delivered them. There was a particular species of cruelty, Cecily had discovered, that wore the costume of regret so naturally that its owner appeared to believe it himself. The solicitor's letter had arrived the following week with an address in Somerset. A Lady Vane of Dressingham Park, near the town of Marlow, required a companion of suitable character and quiet disposition. The engagement would begin at once. The terms were modest. Cecily had accepted before she had finished reading, because there was nothing else to accept. She had not opened her traveling case since Wiltshire. She had not therefore seen the brooch, had not therefore discovered whether the handkerchief was still folded as she had left it, had not therefore had occasion to notice the ring she had not lost, resting against the silk lining beside a piece of jewelry that was not a ring. She held these facts in careful order as the carriage turned off the main road and began its approach to a gatehouse, its torches already lit in the early dark of a December evening. She was still holding the garnet ring in her closed hand. The gates bore a stone escutcheon above the arch, old and weathered, the device still legible, a vine branch, cut and still leafed, the same etched vine leaf pattern as on the shank of the ring. Cecily looked at the gate. She looked at the ring. She closed her fingers again and said nothing. Dressingham Park was a gray stone house that had been large for several generations and did not apologize for it. The rooms were tall and cold and furnished with the assurance of a family that had never needed to demonstrate its wealth because the wealth had always been evident. Lady Portia Vane received Cecily in the drawing-room by the south window. A woman of 55 with silver-streaked black hair arranged with precise formality and sharp gray eyes that performed their assessment in under 3 seconds and reached their conclusion without troubling to conceal it. "Miss Alderton," she said, as though testing the weight of the name. "From Wiltshire." "Yes, my lady." Lady Vane turned back toward the window, where another young woman sat with an embroidery frame, golden brown hair dressed elaborately, an ivory silk gown, the easy posture of someone who has never been required to justify her presence in a room. "Miss Croft is staying with us through the new year," Lady Vane said, in a tone that placed these 2 facts in a particular relationship to each other. "My nephew Edmund is expected before Christmas. I had thought." She did not finish this sentence for Cecily's benefit. She finished it for Miss Croft's. "We shall manage. Your duties will begin in the morning." Later, after the housekeeper had shown her to the small room on the upper floor and left her alone with her trunk and her candle, Cecily heard Lady Vane's voice through the wall, the sound carrying without the words, and then Miss Croft's lower, questioning murmur, and then Lady Vane again, with the particular flattening that certain women achieve when describing something inconvenient. "A traveling woman with no connections, you understand? One makes do." Cecily sat on the edge of the narrow bed. She placed the ring on the washstand. The garnet caught the candlelight and held it, that small ember again. She had not yet decided what to do with it. She had also not yet decided, which was different, what it meant. She learned the shape of the house in the first week by making herself useful in it, not visibly, not self-promotingly, but in the way of women who understand that invisibility is its own currency. She catalogued Lady Vane's correspondence and answered the routine letters. She read aloud in the afternoons when she was asked, and sat quietly when she was not. She found the library on the second morning and spent 20 minutes in it before anyone noticed. long enough to understand that it had been a working room once, and was now merely a furnished one, the books arranged for appearance rather than use. She rearranged nothing. She noted everything. She observed Miss Croft with the impartiality she had trained herself to maintain, and found her neither cruel nor kind, only certain of her welcome, certain of her eventual selection, certain with the particular sureness of a woman who has never yet been passed over for anything she wanted. Miss Croft was not unkind to Cecily. She was simply unaware of her, which was its own variety of erasure, and Cecily was accustomed enough to it to find it bearable. She had not seen Edmund Vane. He was expected, they said. He was delayed, they said. He had been in London, then in Lincolnshire, then on the road. The servant spoke of him in the precise, careful way of people who respect a man they are also slightly afraid of. What she did not know, during that first week, was that she had already been seen. He had stopped at the Trowbridge Inn for the horses 6 days before her arrival at Dressingham, 3 days, therefore, before he had taken a position on the Bath road at dusk, cloaked and still, and waited for a hired carriage he had no reasonable explanation for knowing the route of. He had been eating alone at a table by the fire, a habit of his, when a child had been brought in by a woman who was plainly unwell, a small boy of perhaps 4, bewildered and hungry, the woman behind him barely able to stand. The inn was crowded, and no one moved. A woman at the far table had moved. She was slight, in a dove-gray traveling dress, her brown hair coming loose at the temples from a journey of some hours. She had called the boy by a name she clearly guessed, and gotten it right on the second attempt, which made the child laugh. She had ordered soup and bread and paid for it with coins she produced from a small purse that was clearly nearly empty. And then she had refused the girl's offer to bring her anything for herself, saying only that she had eaten at the last stop, which he did not believe for a moment. Edmund Vane had sat with his meal untouched and watched this woman in a gray dress spend her last coins on a child she did not know. And he had felt something move in him that he had not felt in 4 years, a thing he had no name for in that moment, which he might have called recognition if he had permitted himself the word. He had not permitted himself the word. He had thought, instead, of his mother. He had thought of a ring on a shelf in his study, placed there the morning she died, with a note in her handwriting that said only that when he could not stop thinking of a woman, he should give her this and not be clever about it. He had kept the ring for 6 years, telling himself there was no woman of whom he could not stop thinking. He had kept it after Charlotte died, because he had believed by then that he was not the sort of man who was permitted to give rings to women he wished to keep. He had thought, watching the woman in gray accept the child's soup-stained embrace with matter-of-fact warmth, that his mother had possessed an uncomfortable habit of being right. He arrived at Dressingham 6 days later. He heard Cecily's name spoken at dinner on his second evening, and kept his face very still, and asked once how the new companion had settled. Quietly, Lady Vane said, which was not the answer to the question he had asked. She suits the room. He nodded once and did not ask again. He found his occasions to be in the same spaces she occupied, which was not as difficult to arrange as it should have been. The library was the easiest. Lady Vane rarely went there in the mornings, and Cecily, he had observed, often came to find references for correspondence before the household was fully awake. He spoke to her first in the library, where she was replacing books she had taken down to find a reference for Lady Vane's letter. He had come in for no reason he would have named aloud, and she had looked up from the shelf with the mild, alert expression of someone who has learned never to show surprise. "Miss Alderton," he said. You are familiar with Burleigh's edition? She was holding it. She turned it to show the spine. Sit down, he said. You have been standing for 2 hours. I passed the drawing room. She sat. He did not move. After a moment, he crossed to the chair nearest the window and opened the letter he had not intended to open in the library, and was aware, without looking up from it, of exactly where she was in the room. Aware of the small sound of her turning a page, of the shift of her weight in the chair, of the particular silence of someone reading with full attention. He remained in the library for 40 minutes. He had allocated himself 20. The following week he encountered her in the passage outside the morning room, her arms full of the heavy curtain rings Lady Vane wanted redistributed from the east bedroom. He took the rings from her without asking, which was not a natural thing to do for a man who employed 12 housemaids, and said, "Eat something before the afternoon session. Lady Vane takes 2 hours, and she does not offer tea." "I know," Cecily said. "I have been managing her afternoons for a week." She was right. He had known she was right before he spoke, and had spoken anyway. Because the curtain rings were a reason to stop in the passage, and concern over her missing tea was the most accurate statement he could make, without saying something that would require the ring to be explained. If you are wondering, as I was, what a man who has spent 4 years behind a wall does with a wall that has begun to fail him, stay. The answer is not what the wall expects. He did not speak of the ring. Neither did she. She had placed it, she thought, in a drawer in the washstand, wrapped in the handkerchief beside her mother's brooch, though she sometimes moved it to her pocket when she did not want to examine why. She had concluded, by the end of the 2nd week, that the vine-leaf device on the Dressingham gate was a coincidence she had constructed out of loneliness and tiredness. The ring belonged to the house. She ought to return it. She did not return it. She understood more about Edmund Vane by the end of the 3rd week than she had understood about Lady Aughton after 4 years, because he was consistent in a way that the Countess had not been, not kind, precisely, but accurate. He spoke to people as though their time had value. He found the servants' errors before they became disasters and said what was needed in the minimum sufficient number of words. He had a ward, a boy of 8 named Theo, son of his dead brother, who he treated with a formal gravity that the child appeared to find entirely natural, and who he sometimes allowed to accompany him on the morning inspection of the home farm, as though the boy's opinion on drainage were a matter of genuine interest. Once she had found Theo crying in the back passage, a skinned knee and a broken tin soldier, and she had repaired the soldier with the small sewing kit she carried, and told him 3 things she knew about drainage, which made him laugh. Edmund had appeared in the corridor, looked at the boy's face, looked at her hands with the tin soldier in them, and said, "Thank you." 2 words. He said them as though they cost him something, and he had counted the cost and decided it was worth it. Her pulse had not behaved correctly for the rest of the day. She had begun to understand, by then, why the ring had been given to her, and not refused. She had also begun to understand that understanding was dangerous, because she had no right to the thing she was beginning to understand. She was a companion with no provision, no family, and a trunk with a paste brooch and a garnet ring she had no right to keep. Whatever Edmund Vane had been at dusk on the Bath Road, the man at breakfast in Dressingham Park was an earl. She was practical enough to know the distance between them. She was practical enough, also, to know that practicality and knowledge are not the same thing as feeling, and that her feelings had stopped being practical approximately 3 weeks ago. She wore the ring in her pocket at all times. She was not yet willing to examine this directly. It was Mr. Hayden, Edmund's steward, who told Edmund what he needed to know about the ring. though he did not tell him directly. Edmund had been in his study on a Wednesday evening, reading the quarterly accounts, when he had become aware that something had shifted in the quality of the house. He had gone to find it and found it in the form of Mr. Gerald Ashton, who had arrived without announcement in the front hall, speaking with Lady Vane in a tone of practiced conviviality. Ashton was thicker than Edmund remembered from the one occasion they had met in London, broader at the jaw, more comfortable in his own entitlement. And he had brought a solicitor. The solicitor's business, it emerged over the next 10 minutes, concerned the estate of the late Lady Oughton of Wiltshire. Lady Vane summoned Cecily. Edmund watched from the doorway of the hall. He was not yet in the room, which meant he could observe without altering what he saw, and he had learned long ago that this was often the more useful position. Cecily entered the hall in the composed, careful way she had of entering spaces she was uncertain of, and she took in Ashton and the solicitor in one quiet sweep of her gray eyes. And then she was still. Her hands were at her sides. The right hand had a particular tension in the fingers that he had come to recognize as the gesture she made when she was keeping her face steady by an act of will. Ashton smiled at her. "Miss Alderton, I hope you have had a pleasant few weeks." "I have, sir." "There is a small matter." He nodded to the solicitor, who produced a document. The late Lady Oughton's estate was found to be in some disorder at the time of her passing. Certain items of value were unaccounted for. The executor has been conducting inquiries. He paused. He was watching her face with the expression of a man who expects to see guilt and is content to wait for it. "I wonder if you might be able to account for a ring, a gold band with a garnet setting, that was listed in the inventory of her effects." Cecily was quiet for a moment. She said, "No such ring was ever in my possession from Lady Oughton. I received nothing from the estate." "And yet," Ashton said, with the smooth patience of someone who has arranged his conclusion before his evidence, "we are told that you have been seen in possession of a ring matching that description." Lady Vane's eyes had turned to Cecily with an expression of cold, considered assessment. There was no heat in it, only the precise recalculation of someone who has invested a small amount and is deciding whether to write off the loss. Cecily did not look at Edmund. She did not look anywhere except at Ashton's pleasant, acquisitive face. "The ring is not from the late Lady Oughton's estate," she said. "It is not Lady Oughton's ring." "Nevertheless," Lady Vane said from her chair by the fire, "if there is a ring in this house whose provenance is uncertain, we ought to resolve the question. Lady Vane's household cannot harbor." She did not complete the sentence. She did not need to. The word she had not said sat in the air between them. She asked for the ring. Cecily went to her room and came back with it. She placed it on the table by the door. She kept her expression exactly where she had placed it, because she was not going to allow Ashton the satisfaction of her face, and she did not allow herself to look at Edmund. She looked at the ring. Just once. The garnet caught the candlelight of the hall as it had caught the light in the carriage, as it had caught the firelight in her room at night. And then Lady Vane put it in the solicitor's keeping, which was wrong, and Ashton thanked her for her cooperation, which was worse. Cecily was dismissed from the room. As she reached the door, Lady Vane said, in the tone of one tying off a loose thread, "I think, given the uncertainty, we must conclude your engagement here. The agency can find you another placement." She was given 3 days. She spent the first 2 of those days in the manner she always spent difficulty, in useful motion. She helped pack the linen for the Christmas guests. She finished Lady Vane's correspondence. She sat with Theo for his reading lesson on the second morning, because no one had told him she was leaving, and she thought someone ought to. He received the information with the stoic gravity of a child who has had important people leave before, which meant he sat very still while she told him, and then asked if she would come back, and she had said she did not know, which was the truth, and he had accepted this with a nod as though it were a satisfactory answer, which meant he did not believe it was, and she had had to look away at the window for a moment before she could continue reading. On the second afternoon, she encountered Ashton in the passage outside the kitchen, speaking to a housemaid named Rose, who was 17 and had been in the house since she was 14, in a tone so casually diminishing that Cecily felt it as a physical thing, a cold pressure at the base of her sternum. The same cold she had felt every time Lady Aughton had called her plain or slow or too bookish for the drawing room. Rose's face was white and frightened. Ashton was informing her, with the easy assurance of a man who knows no one will contradict him, that something had gone missing from the guest room, and that the housemaids were the obvious explanation, and that he had no doubt the housekeeper would want to know. Cecily said, "Nothing has gone missing from the guest room." Ashton turned. He looked at her with the particular surprise of a man who had not counted on an audience. "I was in the guest room this morning, putting up the curtains," Cecily said, which was true. Nothing was missing. The silver-topped box you are perhaps thinking of was moved to the cabinet on the right-hand side when the room was cleaned. I moved it myself. Rose's breath released in a small, trembling sound. Ashton looked at Cecily for a long moment. His pleasant face had gone careful. "You are leaving in the morning," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." She did not move from the passage until Rose had gone. She did not permit herself to tremble until she reached the back stairs. She stood at the bottom of them with her hand on the newel post and breathed until the trembling stopped. And then she went back to her room and folded the last of her things into the trunk. Edmund Vane, who had been standing at the far end of the passage in a space the half-open storeroom door had made unobservable, did not move until Cecily had gone. When he did, his voice was very level. "Hayden," he said. "The ring Ashton's solicitor took into custody. Where is it now?" Hayden told him. Hayden also told him, because he had been steward at Dressingham for 31 years and knew his employer, what Ashton had said to Rose, and what Cecily had answered, and what Cecily's face had looked like at the moment she spoke. He told him, further, that Ashton had spoken of Cecily to the solicitor in the hall. He had overheard it through the study door, as a traveling woman with no connections and no recourse, which makes the thing simple. He reported all of these facts in the precise, economical manner of a man who knows the difference between what is necessary and what is decorative. Edmund stood for a moment. "Have the carriage ready at 7 tomorrow morning," he said, "and find me the name of the Assembly's organizing secretary." By the following morning, Cecily had her trunk at the foot of the stairs and had said her goodbye to Theo, and she had put her mother's brooch into her pocket and smoothed her gloves and picked up her traveling case. The hired carriage was to come at noon. She did not know that Edmund had ridden into the village the previous evening. She did not know that he had called at the solicitor's office at 8 in the morning and spoken for 11 minutes, the content of which Hayden would later describe only as definitive. She did not know that the solicitor, after those 11 minutes, had given Edmund the ring, which Edmund had placed in the breast pocket of his riding coat, against the inside of his chest. She was standing in the hall with her trunk when Lady Vane descended the stairs. Lady Vane looked at the trunk. She looked at Cecily. She said, "The carriage is not come." "No, my lady, I am told it may be late." Lady Vane adjusted a glove. "Perhaps you might wait in the kitchen passage." She descended without looking back. The subscription rooms in Marlow were lit every evening of the month, with enough candles to constitute a considerable extravagance. In December, the extravagance deepened to pine boughs on the mantelpieces, The musicians warmly settled in the gallery, the whole room carrying the particular self-consciousness of a country assembly that wishes to demonstrate it has not forgotten how to be an event. Lady Vane arrived at 7:30 with Miss Croft on one arm and Mr. Ashton an unnecessary 2 steps behind, which was the configuration of a woman presenting her conclusion before the argument. Edmund arrived at 8. He arrived without his cloak, which was the only way Cecily would not have known him immediately by the shape of his stillness in a doorway. He wore his navy tailcoat and his white cravat, and crossed the room to Lady Vane with a calm so complete that Mrs. Pendleton, who was standing near enough to have seen his expression, said later that she had thought he was merely come to attend. "A traveling woman with no connections," Mrs. Pendleton murmured to her companion, in the tone she used to convey information she had arranged as opinion. "One wonders what Lord Dressingham thinks of the business." She said this the way people say things they believe they are not saying. Mrs. Pendleton was not correct about what Edmund thought. Cecily was not in the subscription rooms. Cecily was in the kitchen passage of Dressingham Park, waiting for a carriage that had not come, sitting on her trunk in her coat and her gloves in the cold, watching the passage window for the scrape of wheels on the gravel. She had not been told that Edmund had quietly sent word to the hired carriage agency that the engagement was cancelled. She had not been told that his own carriage had been prepared instead. She had not been told that Hayden was at that moment coming to find her. She heard the footstep in the passage and looked up, expecting the housekeeper or the tweenie. Hayden stood at the passage door, his hat in his hands. He was a man of 60. With the precise deferential manner of a steward who has served one family long enough to have earned the right to no longer be deferential, and who chooses to remain so as a courtesy rather than a requirement. "Miss Alderton," he said. "His lordship asks if you will come." She looked at him for a moment. "His lordship is at the assembly." "Yes, miss." She arrived at the subscription rooms at 8:30. She was wearing her gray traveling dress, which was what she was wearing, and her brown gloves, which were what she had on her hands. And her hair was not perfectly arranged, and she had not thought, in Hayden's carriage, to attempt to correct it. Because she had not entirely believed, while in the carriage, that she was going where the carriage was going. The room was warm and bright, and full of people who all turned at once as she entered. Because Edmund had arranged it that way, not deliberately, she would understand later, but because he had been standing at the center of the room speaking to Lady Vane and Mr. Ashton when the door opened, and the room was already watching him, and when he stopped speaking and turned toward the door, the room turned with him. Lady Vane's expression arrived at recognition, and then at something colder, and then at something Cecily had not seen there before, which was uncertainty. Miss Croft lowered her fan by precisely 1/2 inch. Ashton's pleasant face went smooth and careful. Edmund walked across the room. He walked as he always moved, without hurry, without apology, without the performance of importance, simply as a man going toward a thing he has decided to go toward. He stopped in front of Cecily, and he looked at her, and she looked back at him. And the room was very quiet around them both. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailcoat. He held out the ring. In the candlelight, the garnet was the color of something warm, something kept, not lost, not borrowed, not inventoried. It was never lost, he said. His voice was low and level, and it carried precisely as far as it needed to carry. "It was waiting to find you." He said nothing else. He took her gloved hand in his, the right hand, the hand she had extended for a ring on a winter road without knowing why, without deciding, and he slid the gold band onto her finger over the glove, where it could be seen by every person in the room, and felt by her through the worn leather. The garnet burned quietly, The vine leaves on the shank were visible to anyone who looked. Mrs. Pendleton, who had been closest to Lady Vane when Edmund began to cross the room, said afterward that Lady Vane had not spoken, had made no sound, no objection, no effort to redirect. She had simply looked at the ring on Cecily's gloved hand, and then looked away toward the fire. Miss Croft had looked at her own hands, folded in her lap. She had not raised her fan. Ashton had excused himself from the room within the next quarter of an hour, citing an early start for Bristol, and had not been in Marlow again by the time the question of Lady Aughton's ring was resolved, which resolution came 6 weeks later in the form of a letter from the solicitor, acknowledging that the garnet ring listed in the inventory had been a clerical error, the item in question having been sold at auction in 1809, and that the matter was closed. Edmund said when Cecily showed him the letter, "I know." She looked at him. He said, "I told him." "You told him what the ring was," she said. "I told him whose it was," he said. He told her, that evening, about his mother. He told her about Charlotte, not much, and not with self-pity, but with the precise honesty of a man who has decided that a wall was no longer serving its function. Charlotte had been gentle and had died on a February morning, and he had been in the room and had not been able to prevent it. He had been 28 years old, and he had believed, in the months that followed, that grief was a thing with an end, and then he had turned 30 and 32 and 34, and understood that some griefs do not end, but only become a different shape, smaller and harder, and possible to carry. He had put his mother's ring on the shelf in the study that same winter, and had not moved it, because he had thought that moving it would require something of him that he was not prepared to give. "The ring on the shelf was your mother's," Cecily said. "Yes." "Not Charlotte's?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "Charlotte's is buried with her." "As it should be." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "You followed me from Trowbridge." "I was already on the road," he said. "Edmund." A small pause. "I had been watching for you since Trowbridge." It was the first time he had used her name. The syllables were careful and deliberate, as though he had been holding them in reserve for some time and had now put them down precisely where they belonged, in the silence between them, where they remained. She held very still, and felt the pulse in her wrists and in her throat, and in the place behind her sternum where she had been cold for a long time, and she let herself feel it without flinching. They were married in the first week of February, in the church at Marlow, with Theo standing beside Edmund with an expression of concentrated solemnity, and Hayden in the second pew with the precisely correct combination of satisfaction and discretion. It was a small ceremony, by design, because Edmund's design for most things was that they should be sufficient and no more, and because Cecily's design for most things had always been that they should be real. Lady Vane came. She sat at the back of the church and did not speak during the service, and afterward she looked at Cecily in the manner of someone recalibrating a long-held conclusion, and said simply, "I was not fair to you." She did not expand on this. She did not need to. That evening, in the study at Dressingham, Edmund put more wood on the fire, and Theo fell asleep in the chair beside it, his head tipped sideways, his mouth slightly open, the expression of a child who has eaten well and is content in his surroundings. Outside the windows of the study, the February cold pressed in, and the garden was bare and dark and still. Cecily was sitting in the chair opposite the fire, and she was looking at her hand. The ring was on her finger, without the glove now. The garnet was warm in the firelight, no longer a coal-colored question, but something known and kept and familiar, the way a hearth is familiar after you have sat beside it through enough evenings. The vine leaf pattern on the shank caught the light in the same small places it had always caught it, unchanged by everything that had happened to it or around it since a woman had pressed it into the keeping of a shelf and written a note that said, simply, that when he could not stop thinking of a woman, he should give her this and not be clever about it. She thought of the road. She thought of the carriage stopped without warning, the door opening, the hand extended in the fading afternoon. She had thought, on that road, that she was receiving something that required an explanation. She had spent weeks in its company believing she did not deserve to keep it. Edmund came and sat in the chair beside her. He did not speak. He rarely spoke when silence would do, which was one of the things she had learned about him and had come to find as necessary as weather. After a time, he reached across and took her hand, the one with the ring, and turned it slightly toward the fire so that the garnet caught the light, and he held it there. His thumb moved once across the vine leaf pattern on the shank, a small deliberate gesture, barely a movement at all, and then was still. The two of them sat watching the small warm ember in the gold band while Theo slept and the fire settled, and the night deepened around the house that was now hers. There are things given on winter roads that have no adequate explanation. There are things kept in coat pockets for 6 years, waiting for the right pair of hands. There are women who spend years being told their worth does not register on any scale that matters, and men who know better and do not yet know what to do with knowing. The ring had not been lost. It had never, not for a single day of its keeping, been lost. Thank you for staying with Cecily to the end. If her road moved you, leave a word below. Come back when the next fire is lit.